When Daniel Moore took the caretaker job at Stillwater Lodge, he thought he was buying himself some time. Time to get away from the city. Time to escape the endless noise inside his own head. Time to forget the sterile white of hospital hallways, the relentless beeping of machines, and the deafening silence when the heart monitor finally went flat. His wife? Gone. But Stillwater offered a different kind of quiet. It was too quiet. Unnaturally still. The kind of oppressive silence that feels heavy, like it's listening. Behind the lodge was the lake. A perfect, dark circle. Black as oil and just as smooth. The locals had a name for it. The Mouth. On his very first night, Daniel stood at its edge. The cold air biting at his skin. And that's when he heard it. A whisper, carried on the wind, calling his name from somewhere deep beneath the water. It was faint, but achingly familiar, like a memory echoing through his very bones. He shook his head, blaming it on grief. Grief plays tricks on you, he told himself. It makes you hear ghosts. By the second week, the main cabin felt too empty, too cavernous. He found himself sleeping closer to the water, in a small shed by the dock. He was drawn there by a sound, a soft, low humming that began every single night at exactly 3:07 a.m., the exact minute his wife had died. The sound wasn't mechanical, and it wasn't human. It was layered, complex, like hundreds of whispers harmonizing just below the range of normal hearing. He started recording it, obsessed. He'd spend hours with headphones on, straining to understand. One night, playing a tape back, he heard it. Words almost clear, emerging from the static. "We remember you." A choked laugh escaped him, followed by a racking sob. He laughed again through the tears, because the voice that spoke those words, it sounded just like hers. The next morning he went down to the shore. The muddy bank where he'd stood the night before was different. His own boot prints were gone, washed away. But next to where they should have been was a second set of prints. Smaller, barefoot, like a woman's. They led from the tree line, stopped at the water's edge, and then vanished. As if whoever made them had walked straight into the lake. The nearest town was 10 miles away. It had to be an animal, he rationalized. A deer, maybe? But he couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. He drove into town for supplies and mentioned the strange prints to the old man at the bait shop. The man's face went pale. He busied himself with a tangled fishing line, refusing to meet Daniel's eyes. "That lake? It remembers things," the old man mumbled. "You hear a voice? You don't listen. She calls to you. You don't answer." The warning hung in the air, cold and sharp. That night, the humming returned, but it wasn't a whisper anymore. It was a roar, pressing against the walls of his cabin, a physical force. The window panes vibrated, rattling in their frames until a spiderweb of cracks shot through the glass. He clamped his hands over his ears, but it did no good. The sound wasn't outside. It was inside his head. He caught a flash of movement in the small mirror hanging on the wall. He spun around, nothing there. He looked back at the mirror. His own reflection stared back, pale and haggard. But for a split second, he saw something else. Something asterisk under asterisk his reflection, like another face looking up through a sheet of water. In a panic, he grabbed a boot and hurled it at the mirror, shattering it. The glass fell away, but the image that other face had stayed for a single, impossible heartbeat. It blinked, once, slowly, before fading into nothing. The days that followed blurred into a sleepless, paranoid haze. He stopped eating. He just sat, listening. The tape recorder he'd used now played on its own, its spools turning without him touching them. Sometimes, the whispers would start in the middle of the day, and the phrase had changed. It was no longer "we remember you." Now, it was a constant, pleading demand, "Let me in." In a fit of terror, he grabbed the recorder, ran to the dock, and threw it as far as he could into the black water. It sank without a trace. The next morning it was sitting on his bedside table, dripping lake water onto the floorboards, the tape still playing its horrible, hissing invitation. On the 5th night, everything stopped. The humming vanished. The silence that replaced it felt heavier than any sound, a crushing weight on his chest. He stumbled to the window and looked out at the lake. It was perfectly still, a sheet of black glass reflecting the moon. But the reflection of the moon was wrong. It was rippling, trembling, as if something massive just beneath the surface was breathing. A pull he couldn't explain, something between instinct and madness, drew him out of the cabin and down to the dock. The air smelled wrong, thick and metallic, like old iron and damp decay. He stared into the depths, his eyes adjusting to the darkness, and then he saw them. Shapes, moving just below the surface. Hundreds of them, pale, shimmering forms, rising slowly from the abyss. Then, a face broke the surface. Her face, his wife's face. Her eyes were open, wide and blank. Her lips were blue. Her dark hair floated around her head like ink spilled in water. "You left me?" she whispered. Her mouth didn't move, but he heard the words as clearly as if she were standing next to him. His knees gave out. He reached for her, his hand trembling, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on his cheek. And the lake reached back. A pale, cold arm shot out of the water, its grip like iron bands. It pulled him down. The cold was absolute, a shock that stole the air from his lungs. He opened his eyes underwater, and the nightmare truly began. She was there, smiling, But she wasn't alone. She was surrounded by hundreds of others, flickering faces that shifted between life and death, their forms indistinct, their eyes ancient and empty. They moved around him in a silent, swirling tide. He tried to scream, but only swallowed the cold, suffocating darkness. Weeks later, when the owner finally came to check on the property, he found the lodge empty. The front door was wide open, swinging in the breeze. Inside, everything was untouched, a layer of dust settling on the furniture. But outside, the thick ropes mooring the dock had been snapped, torn free as if by a violent, localized storm. The lake itself was placid and calm. On the muddy shore, they found two things: Daniel's worn work boots, placed neatly side by side, and his tape recorder. The tape inside was blank. Almost if you turned the volume all the way up, you could hear one faint, persistent line of static, and if you listened long enough, you started to think it sounded like breathing. The locals will tell you to stay away from Stillwater, especially on moonless nights. They say if you stand by the edge and close your eyes, you can still hear a low, steady humming rising from the depths. They say the lake remembers, and if you listen too closely, it might just remember your name too.